a millionaire left her phone on a table at a Tim Hortons in Sudbury. Inside it, 11 years of private messages, her daughter's medical records, every password she'd ever used, and one voicemail she hadn't been able to delete in 3 years. She didn't notice it was gone. She didn't call the store. She drove 40 minutes north in a Cadillac Escalade toward a meeting that was worth $2 million, and she never once checked her pocket. But the woman behind the counter, the one making $13.40 an hour, working the 5 a.m. shift because it was the only one that fit around her mother's dialysis schedule, found it under a napkin dispenser at 7:20. She didn't put it in the lost and found box. She asked her manager to cover her brake, got in her car, and drove. Loretta Beaumont? No, wait. The name was already used. The woman's name was Cecile. No. Start again, from the right place. Her name was Odette Marchand, 51 years old. 40 minutes outside Sudbury in a town called Chelmsford, in a house that had been in her mother's family since 1962, with a furnace that knocked every time the temperature dropped below -12, and a kitchen window that had been taped at the corner since the fall before last. She worked the early shift at the Tim Hortons on Notre Dame Avenue, because the morning differential added 60 cents to her hourly wage, and because the morning supervisor, a woman named Paulette, already used. A woman named Greta Sundqvist let her leave by 1 o'clock so she could pick up her mother from the Sudbury Regional Dialysis Unit by 1:30. And the millionaire, the one who left her phone, her name was Renata Solberg Price, 54, CEO of a company called Northgate Infrastructure Partners, which had just won a federal contract to rehabilitate 3 highway corridors across northern Ontario. Renata had grown up in Kapuskasing, the daughter of a mill worker, and she had spent 30 years clawing her way into boardrooms that had not been designed with her in mind. She was not a cruel woman. She was not even a cold one. She was simply a woman who had been moving so fast for so long that she had stopped noticing the details. The phone sitting on the table was a detail. The woman behind the counter was a detail. The coffee she hadn't finished was a detail. Everything that was not the next meeting, the next contract, the next number was a detail she had stopped seeing years ago. The phone Renata left behind was a black iPhone in a charcoal case. No cracks, no stickers, nothing to identify the owner from the outside. Odette found it at 7:22 in the morning, after the rush had thinned and she was wiping down the 2 top tables by the window. She picked it up, turned it over. No name on the case. She brought it to Greta, who called it in to the district office as lost property. Standard protocol. The phone would go into a labeled bag in the safe, and if no one claimed it within 30 days, it would be sent to head office. Odette went back to her station. She made drinks. She took orders. She watched the phone sitting in its labeled bag on the counter behind the register. At 8:15, the phone buzzed through the plastic bag. Then again. Then 3 times in quick succession. Then a notification light pulsed red at the corner of the screen, slow and persistent, the way a light pulses when something has been missed. It was none of Odette's business. She knew that. She had put it in the bag and handed it to Greta, and that was the right thing to do, and none of what was on that phone was her concern. But at 8:47, when Greta went into the back to do the morning inventory, Odette picked up the bag and looked at the screen through the plastic. The notification at the top of the display, visible without unlocking, read, Eleanor, missed call, 3 messages. Below it, Northern Health Gateway, appointment reminder, Tuesday 9 a.m. And below that, Harcourt Investment Group, final terms, please, call before 10. Odette set the bag back down. She made a large double-double for a man in a Inco retiree jacket. She made a small steeped tea. She thought about a voicemail someone hadn't been able to delete in 3 years, which she did not know about because she couldn't see it. She thought about the missed calls from Eleanor, which she could see through the plastic. She thought about the appointment at 9 a.m. Then she thought about her own mother, Celestine, who had left a glove on the bus 2 winters ago. Just one glove, the right one, and had cried quietly about it for an entire evening because those gloves had been a gift from Odette's father, who had been gone 9 years and there was not a replacement for them anywhere in the world. Odette took off her apron. She told Greta she needed her break early. She picked up the bag and she drove. To understand what Odette did next, you have to understand something about the life she'd been living for the past 4 years, which is the kind of life that does not get described in annual reports or newspaper profiles, or any of the places where lives get described. It is the kind of life that happens in Tim Hortons parking lots at 4:45 in the morning, and in dialysis waiting rooms with the same 3 magazines from 2019. And in kitchens where you stand at the stove making soup and run the numbers in your head one more time because you have been running the same numbers for 4 years and they keep coming out wrong. Odette had worked at the Tim Hortons on Notre Dame for 7 years. Before that, she had worked at the school board as an educational assistant for 9 years. And before that, she had worked part-time at the Co-op Grocery on Paris Street while she finished her college certificate in early childhood education, which she had started at 33 and finished at 36, because the money kept running out and the semesters kept getting deferred. She had never been unemployed. She had never missed a shift. She had, in the way of many women in her situation, simply never earned quite enough. Not for emergencies, not for savings, not for the furnace to fail and the car to need tires in the same month, which it did 2 Februaries ago and which had cost her $3. $400 she did not have and was still paying back at $180 a month. Her mother, Odette Marchand, was 79 years old and had been on dialysis for 3 years, 3 times a week, 4 hours a session. A 40-minute drive each way. Celestine's kidneys had failed slowly and then quickly, the way things fail when you have spent decades working a body hard and eating whatever was on sale and never once going to the doctor until you had no choice. The dialysis kept her alive. It also kept her exhausted, gray, and present in a diminished way. Still Celestine. Still the woman who had made tourtière every Christmas since 1978 and who could still name every plant in her garden by its Latin name, but quieter now. Tired in a way that ran deeper than sleep could fix. The dialysis cost nothing, because this was Canada, and the treatment itself was covered. But the driving cost gas, and the special foods cost money, and the compression stockings, the blood pressure medications, the supplements the doctors recommended. All of it added up to approximately $600 a month beyond what Celestine's pension and Odette's salary could comfortably absorb. Comfortably. That word was doing considerable work in that sentence. Odette did not own a smartphone. She had a 6-year-old Samsung with a cracked screen protector that she kept meaning to replace. She did not have savings. She had $340 in a checking account and a property tax deferral she had applied for in March that had not yet been approved. She drove a 2009 Hyundai Elantra with 211,000 kilometers on it. And the mechanic on Falconbridge Road had told her in September that the front control arm bushings were worn through and that she should get them done before winter. And she had said she would look at it, and she had not looked at it because looking at it meant either spending money she didn't have or deciding not to spend it and living with the knowledge of what she hadn't done. All of this is to say, when Odette Marchand picked up a smartphone that did not belong to her, she was holding in her hand a device that likely cost more than her car was currently worth. And on that phone, somewhere, was the digital life of a woman with the means to make Odette's problems disappear without noticing the money was gone. She drove anyway. The phone had a business card tucked into the case. She found it when she took the phone out of the bag to check if it had a name on the back. Northgate Infrastructure Partners. Renata Solberg Price, President and CEO. Below the title, a direct phone number. Below the phone number, a Sudbury address on Elm Street. Odette typed the address into her phone. 19 minutes. She drove north on Notre Dame, through the lights at Barrydown, past the Walmart and the Canadian Tire, and the stretch of fast food signs that marked the edge of Sudbury's commercial belt. The morning was overcast and white in the way February mornings are white in northern Ontario. Not bright, just evenly illuminated, the sky the same color as the snow on the median. Her heater worked. The control arm clunked softly over a pothole on the bridge. She gripped the steering wheel a little tighter and kept going. The address led her to a building on Elm that she had driven past probably 100 times without registering it. A renovated brick building with a gray awning and a Northgate logo on the glass door, understated in the way that expensive things are understated. Odette sat in the parking lot for a moment. She looked at the phone in its charcoal case. She thought about the notification from Eleanor. She thought about the appointment at 9. She went inside. The woman at the front desk was young, well-dressed, and visibly confused by the appearance of a person in a Tim Hortons visor carrying someone else's phone at 20 minutes past 9 in the morning. "I found this," Odette said. "It belongs to your CEO. She left it at the Tim Hortons on Notre Dame about 2 hours ago." The receptionist stared at her, then at the phone. "I can take that for you," she said, reaching forward. Odette pulled back just slightly. "I'd rather give it directly to Miss Solberg Price, if that's possible." There were some missed calls coming through. It seemed urgent. "Ms. Solberg Price is in a meeting." "I know," Odette said. "I can wait." She sat down in the reception area on a low gray chair that probably cost more than her couch. There was a water dispenser with actual lemons in it. There were framed photographs of highway corridors and bridge superstructures on the walls. There was music playing very quietly, something instrumental and unhurried. Odette sat with the phone in her lap and watched the elevator doors. At 10:08, the elevator opened. A woman in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers stepped out, moving the way people move when they are always moving, purposeful, contained, her attention already on whatever was next. She was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome for a long time. The receptionist said something to her. She stopped. She looked at Odette. Renata Solberg Price crossed the lobby in 15 steps. "That's my phone," she said. "Yes," Odette said, standing. She held it out. "You left it at the Tim Hortons on Notre Dame. I work there. I found it at 7:30. Renata took the phone. She looked at the screen, the missed calls, the notifications that had stacked up. Something moved across her face. Not relief. Something closer to discomfort, which is what relief looks like in people who are not used to needing things they can't provide for themselves. "The Harcourt call," she said, almost to herself. Then she looked up. "How did you find this office? Your business card was in the case." Renata looked at the card in Odette's hand, then at Odette directly for the first time. "You drove here. It's 19 minutes. You drove 19 minutes to return a phone to someone you don't know." Odette shrugged. There were calls coming through. It seemed like someone needed to reach you. Renata was quiet for a moment. She opened her wallet. "Let me give you something for the trouble." "You don't need to do that." "I'd like to." "I didn't do it for money," Odette said. Not harsh, just clear. "It wasn't mine." Renata's hand stayed in the wallet. She looked at Odette with an expression that was harder to read than the one before it. Not calculating, not dismissive, something more uncertain, the expression of a woman who had just encountered something she did not have a category for. "Can I at least get your name?" "Odette Marchand." Renata put her wallet away. She looked at her phone again, at the stack of notifications. Then she looked back across the lobby at the door through which Odette was about to leave. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it, in the way you mean a thing when you realize you've forgotten how to mean things. Odette nodded. She put on her coat. She drove back to Chelmsford to pick up her mother. If this story is reaching you, take a moment to subscribe. There are more like it coming. Renata Solberg Price did not forget about Odette Marchand. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. She had expected the feeling to pass the way the feelings attached to small, unexpected moments usually passed. Quickly, cleanly, without leaving a mark. But the feeling did not pass. It sat in her chest in the weeks that followed like a stone she kept finding in her pocket. She thought about it in the car on the way to the Harcourt meeting, which she was late for, and which she handled anyway, because she had been handling things she was unprepared for her entire career. She thought about it at dinner that night, alone in the house on York Street that had 4 bedrooms and 1 set of dishes and a dining table that sat 8 and was always set for 1. She thought about it when her daughter Eleanor called on Thursday evening and asked how she was. And Renata said fine. And Eleanor said, "You always say fine." And Renata said, "I know," and there was a pause on the line that lasted 4 seconds and contained 30 years of abbreviated conversations. Neither of them had ever finished. Eleanor, Solberg price was 27. She lived in Halifax, where she worked as a marine biologist for a federal research institute. She had her father's eyes and Renata's stubbornness and a relationship with her mother that was polite and careful and architecturally sound in the way that relationships are when they have been engineered to withstand distance and to require nothing from each other in the meantime. Eleanor called on Thursday evenings. Renata sent birthday cards by registered mail. They texted photographs of things they had seen. Birds, bridges, odd signs in grocery stores, without attaching explanations, which was the closest either of them came to saying, "I am still here. I am still thinking of you." The gap between them was not dramatic. It had never been dramatic. It had simply widened, year by year, in the way gaps widen when you stop stepping across them because the stepping is hard, and you are always tired, and there is always something else that needs attending to first. Renata had not grown up planning to become this. She had grown up in Kapuskasing, in a house that smelled like sawdust and supper. The youngest of 4 children, the first in her family to go to university, the first to leave the North, and then the one who had come back, which was not what anyone had expected, including her. She had built her company from a $40,000 line of credit and a government tender she had won by underbidding 4 larger firms and then spending 3 years delivering the work perfectly so that no one could ever say she had won because she was cheaper. She had built it on competence and endurance and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been told, in various ways and by various people, that she was unlikely to succeed, which had made the succeeding feel personal in a way that made stopping feel impossible. She had been moving for 30 years. She had stopped noticing what she was moving past. A week after the morning at the Tim Hortons, Renata called the store and asked for the manager. She learned that Odette Marchand worked the 5 a.m. shift 3 days a week and covered additional shifts when the staffing was thin, which was often. She learned nothing else, because there was nothing else the manager could appropriately share. And Renata was not the kind of woman who pushed past what was appropriate. But she did what she had always done with problems that would not leave her alone. She started gathering information. It was not surveillance. It was not intrusion. It was the application of the same careful attention she gave to every project that mattered. The same methodical accumulation of facts that told you, eventually, what you were actually dealing with. What she found, through a combination of public records, a conversation with someone at the municipality, and one phone call she was not sure was entirely appropriate to make, was this. Odette Marchand was 51 years old. She had worked at the same Tim Hortons for 7 years and had been a model employee by every available measure. She owned a house in Chelmsford that had an assessed value of $198,000 and a municipal tax deferral application pending since March. She was the sole caregiver for her mother, Celestine Marchand, who was receiving dialysis 3 times weekly at Sudbury Regional. Her income, estimated from the available employment records and the Ontario minimum wage schedule, was approximately $28,000 a year before tax. Her property was listed on the municipal arrears roll for $2,200. Not a large sum, but the kind of sum that, when you are making $13.40 an hour and driving to dialysis 3 times a week, becomes a wall. Renata sat with these numbers for a long time. She thought about herself at 32, which was the year the mill in Kapuskasing had shut down, and her father had come home with the particular face men wear when something they had given 30 years to has decided that 30 years was enough. She thought about the first time she had walked into a bank to ask for a business loan and been told by a man who was not as smart as her, and who knew it, that her projections were unrealistic. She thought about Kapuskasing in February and the particular silence of a town that is not dying but has stopped growing, and what it costs a person, what it really costs, to keep showing up to a life that keeps presenting itself as insufficient. She thought about a woman who had driven 19 minutes through a February morning to return a phone that was not hers to a person she did not know, and who had refused money when it was offered, and who had said, with no drama and no expectation, "It wasn't mine." Renata did not go to the Tim Hortons. She found the house. It was a weekday afternoon in March, the kind of afternoon when the snow is still on the ground, but you can feel, very faintly, that it is considering leaving. Renata drove herself. No driver, no assistant, just the Escalade and the address. She parked across the street from a small white house with green shutters and a birch tree in the front yard that still had a few dried seeds clinging to its branches. She knocked on the door. It was Celestine who answered. Smaller than Renata had expected, wrapped in a cardigan the color of oatmeal, with Odette's same dark eyes and the careful alertness of a woman who had learned, over many years, to read situations quickly and from the doorway. "I'm looking for Odette," Renata said. "My name is Renata Solberg Price. She returned something of mine. I wanted to thank her properly." Celestine studied her for a moment. Then she stepped aside and let her in. The house was clean, small, organized, with the particular tidiness of a space where someone has made a conscious decision to impose order on circumstances they cannot fully control. There were books on every flat surface, not decoratively, just books, the kind that had been read. There was a plant on the kitchen windowsill, with new growth pushing from the base. There was a photograph on the wall near the door. Odette and Celestine at what looked like a lake in summer, both of them squinting into the sun, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Odette came out of the back of the house in jeans and a fleece, her hair tied back, her expression moving through surprise, recognition, and caution in about 3 seconds. "Mrs. Solberg Price, Renata," Renata said. There was a pause. Celestine disappeared into the kitchen, which was the thing mothers do when they want to listen without being seen to listen. Renata sat in the living room chair that was offered to her. Odette sat on the end of the couch with her hands flat on her knees, the way people sit when they are trying to be still, without looking like they are working at it. "I'm not here to give you money," Renata said. "I figured I'd say that first." Odette said nothing, waited. "I looked into your situation. I want to be honest about that. I know that might seem strange." She paused. "I found your phone and you drove it across the city. I couldn't stop thinking about that. I couldn't stop thinking about why. It was the right thing to do. I know. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about." Silence. The heat came on with a soft clunk from somewhere below the floor. Renata leaned forward. "My company has a community partnership initiative. We work with municipalities across northern Ontario. Part of it involves supporting employment pathways for mid-career adults. People who have experience and capability and haven't had access to credentials that reflect it." She chose her words carefully, not because she was uncertain but because she was trying to be accurate. "I have an administrative coordination position opening in our Sudbury office. It pays $52,000 to start with a full benefits package, health, dental, and extended. The person I hire will be trained fully on our systems, no prior experience in infrastructure required." Odette was very still. "I'm telling you this," Renata continued, "because I looked at what you've built, the caregiving, the consistency, 7 years without missing a shift, and I think you are exactly the kind of person who can do this work. Not as charity, as an informed decision on my part. You would have to earn the rest." She paused. "And I need to know if you're interested before I say anything else, because if you're not, I'll leave and we won't speak of it again." The room was quiet. From the kitchen came the sound of a kettle being filled. "Why?" Odette said. The same word Darnell had asked, in a different city, in a different winter, for the same reason. Not suspicious, just honest. Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said the thing she had not planned to say, which was the thing that happened to be true. My father worked the mill in Kapuskasing for 31 years. He never missed a shift either. When it closed, there was nothing for him. No transition, no support, no one who looked at what he knew and thought it was worth building on. She looked at her hands. He died 4 years later. He was 62. He had nothing wrong with him, except that he had stopped having a reason to get up in the morning. She looked up. I have spent 30 years building a company that bids on government contracts and manages infrastructure budgets. I have never once gone back and done the thing my father needed someone to do for him. Her voice was steady, not performed, just stated. You drove 19 minutes to do the right thing when it cost you something. That told me something about who you are. I would rather invest in someone like you than spend another year wondering why it still bothers me that nobody invested in him. Odette sat with that for a long time. From the kitchen, the kettle clicked off. Celestine appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, placed them on the table between the 2 women, and left without a word, which was the most eloquent thing she could have done. Odette picked up her cup. She held it with both hands. Can I make a phone call? She asked. Renata nodded. Odette dialed, waited. Her mother answered from the kitchen, which made both of them, for just a moment, smile. Then Odette said, Maimon, I need to tell you something, and she told her. All of it. The job, the salary, the benefits. And then she stopped, because she had reached the word benefits, and what came after it was health and dental and extended. And what extended meant was prescriptions and specialist appointments and the compression stockings and the supplements that added up to $600 a month and had been adding up for 3 years. And she couldn't get the word out. She didn't need to. From the kitchen came a sound. Not words. Something older than words. The sound of a woman who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just, without warning, been allowed to put it down. Renata sat in the living room of that small house in Chelmsford, with the February light coming through the window and the kettle smell still in the air, and listened to Odette Marchand cry in her own kitchen. And she thought about her father coming home from the mill with that particular face. She thought about Eleanor, who called on Thursday evenings and said, "How are you?" and waited for a real answer that never came. She thought about a dining table on York Street with 1-place setting and 8 chairs. She set her cup down, and she did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying on its own. Over the following 12 months, Odette Marchand rebuilt. It did not happen the way rebuilding happens in the kind of stories that move quickly, where a single conversation becomes a montage and the hard parts are compressed into a sentence or 2. It happened the way it actually happens, which is slowly and imperfectly, and with setbacks that don't make good narrative. Her first week at Northgate Infrastructure Partners, Odette arrived 30 minutes early, stood in the lobby of the building on Elm Street, and looked at the names of the bridges and corridors on the walls and thought, I am going to have to learn so much. Then she went in and started learning. She was not the youngest person in the office. She was not the most polished. There were people there who had university degrees and industry experience, and the kind of easy fluency with corporate language that takes years to acquire. She watched them, and she said very little in the first few weeks, and she asked careful questions. And she did not ask the same question twice. In her 4th month, she noticed an error in a contractor invoice, a duplication in the material line items that had been submitted for 2 separate sections of the same corridor, totaling $47,000. She flagged it quietly in an email to the project lead with 1 line of explanation. I believe this was submitted in duplicate. I wanted to make sure it was looked at before the payment run. She was right. The duplication was caught. The contractor acknowledged an administrative error. $47,000 stayed in the project budget and went toward the work it was meant to fund. No drama, no announcement, just accurate numbers and the decision to say something about them. After that, people in the office stopped looking at her the way they had looked at her in the first few weeks. Meanwhile, Celestine began to stabilize. The new insurance covered the medications and the dietary supplements and the specialist appointments, that had been deferred for 2 years because deferring them had been the only option. Her dialysis continued. She was not cured. Dialysis does not cure, it manages, but the managing became more manageable. She had more energy on the days between sessions. She made tortilla at Christmas. She went back to her garden in April and stood with her hands in the cold soil and named things. Renata was changing too, in the quiet way that people change when they have stopped pretending that the life they are living is the only one available to them. She started taking her calls in the break room sometimes, instead of her office. She learned the name of the facilities manager, who had worked in the building for 11 years and who she had never once addressed by name. She asked her project leads, at the end of their monthly check-ins, a question she had never asked before. Is there anything you need that you haven't felt like you could ask for? The question made people uncomfortable at first. Then it made things better. She called Eleanor more often. Not just Thursdays. Sometimes just to say that she had driven past a bridge that morning and thought about the time Eleanor had made her stop in the middle of it on a road trip when Eleanor was 11 because she wanted to watch the water go underneath. Eleanor remembered. Renata had not known that Eleanor remembered. You're different, Eleanor said on a call in October. Am I? A pause. Good different. Renata sat at her desk with her phone pressed to her ear and the city of Sudbury going dark outside the window. I met someone, she said. Not like that. Someone who reminded me of something. Tell me. And she told her. She told her about the morning at Tim Hortons and the phone on the table and the woman who had driven 19 minutes to return it and the house in Chelmsford and the cup of tea Celestine had placed on the table without saying a word. She told her about her own father and what she had not been able to do for him and what she had tried to do instead, even though she knew they were not the same thing and were never going to be the same thing. Eleanor was quiet for a long time after. Is she good at her job? She asked finally. Very, Renata said. Good. Another pause. I'd like to meet her. Sometime. Both of them. The mom too. I think that can be arranged. They in January at the house in Chelmsford, which Celestine had prepared for with the focused hospitality of a woman who has been making people welcome in small spaces her whole life. Eleanor drove from Sudbury's bus station, having taken the overnight from Toronto. Odette made soup. Celestine's made something with chicken that had been marinating since Tuesday. Eleanor Solberg Price walked into that kitchen and shook Odette's hand and said, simply, thank you for giving me something to talk to my mother about. Odette did not know quite what to do with that, so she said, your mother gave me more than I know how to repay, and Eleanor said, I think you're even, actually. And then Celestine put food on the table, and they sat. 4 women, around a kitchen table in Chelmsford in January, and the soup was good, and the chicken was better, and the conversation was the kind that fills a room and doesn't stop at the walls. Renata drove herself home afterward, late, the highway north back towards Sudbury dark and straight and familiar. She passed the Tim Hortons on Notre Dame. All the Tim Hortonses, actually. There were several between Chelmsford and York Street, and she thought about a morning in February when she had left her phone on a table and not noticed and driven away. She thought about the sound of Celestine crying in the kitchen. She thought about Eleanor on the bus, overnight from Toronto, because Renata had told her about a woman who had done the right thing, and Eleanor had wanted to meet her. She thought about her father. She thought about what her father had been worth, which was not what anyone had paid him. A year after the afternoon in the living room with 2 cups of tea, Renata called Odette into her office. She sat behind her desk and she had a folder open in front of her. And she said, I want to talk to you about something. What she wanted to talk about was a proposal. Northgate was expanding its community partnership work. Part of the expansion involved creating a regional intake program for mid-career adults in Northern Ontario communities. People with demonstrated capability who lacked the formal credentials that the job market required to see them. The program would provide mentorship, skill certification support, and employment pathways within the infrastructure sector and its adjacent industries. It needed a coordinator. someone who understood from the inside what it meant to have the experience without the paper. Odette's name was on the folder, not as a charity case, as the program lead. Her name and her salary, which was going up. Odette read the folder. She read it again. She looked up. "You're asking me to run it. I'm asking you if you want to. It's different from what you're doing now. It's harder. It requires you to make decisions I won't always be there to back up. And you'll have to build it, which means you'll have to figure out a lot of it as you go." Renata looked at her steadily. "But I watched you figure out our invoicing system in 6 weeks and flag a $47,000 error that 3 people with CPA designations had missed. So I'm not worried about the figuring out part." The office was quiet. "My mother's appointment is on Tuesdays," Odette said. "Tuesdays are protected," Renata said. "Non-negotiable. Put it in the calendar, and no one touches it." Odette nodded slowly. Then she picked up the folder, tucked it under her arm, and said, "I'll call my mother." The call lasted 11 minutes. When it was done, Odette had said very little because Celestine had talked for most of it. About the house on the lake, where Odette's grandmother had grown up, and about the winter Odette's father had spent 3 months unemployed, and what that had done to all of them, and about the morning Odette had come home from school at 17 and said she wanted to go to college, and they didn't have the money, and Celestine had sat her down and said, "We will find a way," and they had eventually found one. "You are going to say yes," Celestine said. "Not a question." "Yes, Maimon." "Good." A pause. "Come for dinner Tuesday." That spring, a man named Gord Arsenault walked into the intake office of the Northgate Community Pathway Program on Brady Street in Sudbury. He was 53 years old, had worked in the mining sector for 22 years, and had been laid off 18 months earlier when the company restructured and eliminated his role. A logistic coordination position that had not existed under that name when he started, but which he had effectively invented over a decade of doing it. He had applied for 47 jobs. He had received 3 interviews. He had not been hired. He had printed his resume on paper that was slightly heavier than standard because someone on a forum had told him it would stand out. Odette sat across from him at a small table in the waiting room and looked at the resume and then at him and said, "Tell me what you actually did, not what it says here." And he told her, and she listened, and then she said, "The title is wrong and the language is wrong, but the work is exactly right. Let me show you how to say it so people can see it." Gord Arsenault was hired 8 weeks later by a municipal infrastructure firm in North Bay. He sent Odette a card, handwritten. He was not much of a writer, he said, but he wanted her to know. She pinned it to the corkboard above her desk. By the end of the first year, the program had placed 19 people in employment and was in conversation with 2 additional municipalities about expanding into their regions. Odette had hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Vivienne, already used. Her name was Petra Korhanen, who was finishing her community development diploma at Cambrian College and who arrived every morning 5 minutes early and left every evening knowing more than she had known when she arrived. Renata, on a Thursday evening in October, stood at the window of the house on York Street and looked at the backyard, which was dark and empty in the way October backyards are. She had just come off a call with Eleanor, who had been promoted to senior researcher, who had begun, for the first time in her adult life, calling Renata on days that were not Thursday. She thought about a woman who had driven 19 minutes in February. She thought about everything those 19 minutes had set in motion. The research on moral behavior in low-stakes versus high-stakes situations is consistent on one point. What people do when no one is watching tends to be a more reliable indicator of character than anything they do when they are. A 2019 study conducted across 40 countries found that found wallets were returned at significantly higher rates when they contained more money. An apparent reversal of self-interest that researchers attributed to the increasing psychological cost of self-identifying as a thief as the stakes rose. The study's conclusion was not that people are good. It was that character has thresholds, and that some people's thresholds are set at a level the rest of us tend to underestimate. Odette Marchand's threshold had been set early and set well. Not because her life was easy, because someone had taken the time to set it. Celestine Marchand had arrived in Sudbury in 1973 from a small town in the Saguenay, 22 years old, with $60 and a suitcase and the address of a cousin who turned out to have moved 3 months earlier. She had found work within a week, found an apartment within 2, and found a church within 3, and she had never once, not in 50 years of living in Sudbury, of working and losing and raising a daughter mostly on her own and watching the city change around her, she had never once done a thing she was ashamed of. Not because she hadn't had the opportunity. Because she had decided early and firmly that certain opportunities were not the kind she was in the business of taking. She had passed that decision to Odette the way you pass a thing that matters. Not with speeches or instructions, but by example, by repetition, by the daily demonstration of what it looks like to live inside a set of values you have not put up for negotiation. If it isn't yours, you return it, not because someone will find out, because you will know. Odette had heard that in various forms her entire life. She had heard it so many times it had become something she no longer noticed, the way you stop noticing the sound of your own heartbeat. She had not known, on the morning of the February she picked up a phone from under a napkin dispenser, that she was about to do something that would change the course of her life. She had just known that the phone was not hers, and that someone needed it, and that she was the person who could return it. The rest of it, the job, the salary, the benefits, the program on Brady Street, the card from Gord Arsenault pinned above her desk, had followed from that. Not because the universe rewards virtue in any clean or guaranteed way, but because Renata Solberg Price had been paying enough attention, for once, to notice. 2 winters later, on a Tuesday evening after dialysis, Odette drove her mother home on the same route she had driven 3 times a week for years. South on Paris, west on Notre Dame, out toward Chelmsford. The light was going flat and blue the way February light goes at 5:15. Celestine was quiet in the passenger seat, tired in the way she was always tired after treatment, her head resting slightly toward the window. They passed the Tim Hortons on Notre Dame. "You know," Celestine said without opening her eyes, "that's where it started." "I know, Maman. I'm glad you stopped." Odette glanced over at her mother. Celestine had her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap and the expression of a woman who is tired and warm and does not need anything to be different from what it is. "Me too," Odette said. She drove on. The birch trees along the highway had ice on their branches, and the headlights caught it as she passed. And for just a moment, in the blue February dark, everything along the road was briefly, quietly lit.